Well, this is earlier than I expected. I thought I'd have a chance to have a sleep. Cloud juice. I come up here feeling rather happy because Jill whispered to me she'd had a discussion with Sandy, and Sandy was very proud to say that she found no spelling mistakes in my book. So I'm happy. Well, my friends, I stand here this morning and I look at you and I wonder, are you the evidence that the world is going mad? Hang on, got that wrong. Oh, sorry, I'll read it out. I stand here this morning and look at you and I wonder, are you seeing the evidence and, like me, thinking that the world is going mad? That's what I meant to say. What's happening? You know, I don't have to talk too much about it. You know what's going on with social justice activism, political correctness, gender identity, grievance ideology, inclusivity and diversity. Companies have inclusivity policy managers these days. A good job for somebody here if you're looking for work. You're not allowed to say you have to say happy holidays, not happy Christmas anymore. Even Disney, in their latest Toy Story movie, have a couple of gay characters giving a gay kiss, which upset quite a lot of people. And if you look at advertising, as I don't, you notice that they present lifestyles, minority lifestyles, as normal. Heard a joke the other day that in third world countries, they're teaching 9-year-old children science and maths, and here in Australia, they're teaching 9-year-old children that men can have babies. If you disagree with anything like this, you get vilified or cancelled. Just ask J.K. Rowling, the creator of Harry Potter, who said, surprisingly, she disapproved of doors of female bathrooms and changing rooms being opened to any man who believes or feels he's a woman. The Twitterverse dropped. Christian rugby players are vilified for refusing to wear jerseys that celebrate a proud gay lifestyle. Those words, celebrate a proud gay lifestyle. But a Muslim football player sat out a gay pride game and was congratulated for standing by her faith with dignity. Confused? Do you think, like me, the world is going mad? And some of that maybe have taken an extra note with the recent Australian census, where we found that only about 40% of people have no religious belief. And that's a major change from past years. But let's take note that only in the West is atheism growing. Christianity is on fire in places like Asia and Africa. It's only here that atheism is wandering down a strange one-way pathway. So how do we respond to all of that? One of the ways is to consider ourselves being a bad guy. Stephen McAlpine, a Perth pastor and blogger, has written a great book. Recommend you get it. And he says it's a relief to be able to say that Australia is not a Christian country any longer. Perhaps now we can get on with evangelising it. He says a lot more. You've got to buy the book. After you buy mine, of course. The National Church Life Survey shows that there is an openness to spirituality, including the Christian faith, perhaps more than we would expect. And this is an encouraging note. It's a mistake to assume that Australians are closed to the Christian faith. And what we find is that there's yet another opportunity to offer what the good news is. Because the encouraging thing is that we've been here before. And I understand that you've been here before as well. You've had somebody preach on 1 Peter chapter 1 recently, is that correct? No? You don't remember? Okay, yes, all right. I hope our views align. If not, well, he's wrong. So as we know, 1 Peter is a letter to Christ followers in modern-day Turkey. And those believers were exiled and they were living on the margins of society. And the message for their reality is our message as well. They were there, we are here again. And the whole point is that with the book of Peter is to identify with Christ's faithful witness in the face of suffering. And Christ refused to retaliate against people who mistreated him. And that's the message for us. In Hebrews 13:12-13, we're told that there's nothing unusual with being on the margins of society. There's nothing unusual in being the minority, because it happened to Jesus. He suffered, in verse 12, outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. And then verse 13, let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. So that's the reality. That's our reality. 1 Peter 1:6, the writer alludes to people suffering grief in all kinds of trials. And then in chapter 4, verses 3-4, those all kinds of trials are described in more detail. They were victims of slander, animosity and scorn. Does that sound familiar? They were marked as social misfits. Does that sound familiar? Held in contempt because they were disloyal to prevailing social values. So let's face it, being on the margins is not an unusual experience. An overarching thing to remember in 1 Peter chapter 1 is clear, and remember this because we'll come back to it at the close. We have a message of enduring hope. In verse 7, there's suffering so that the proven genuineness of your faith may result in praise when Jesus Christ is revealed. Verse 13 in 1 Peter 1, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace you will receive when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. Verse 24, I'll touch on this in more detail. For all people are like grass, their glory like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall. And 25, but the word of the Lord endures forever. That's our enduring hope. Let's go back to verse 24 to just establish a point as we move on. It says there, we're already seeing the grass withering and flowers are falling, because there's evidence that the backlash is happening against all of this political correctness. There are a couple of people who wrote a book called Cynical Critical Theories. Now, I want to point out that the people who wrote this book are left-wingers. They are social progressives. They are sort of arguing for political correctness in a way. They're arguing for the values of social justice activism. Okay, so they're on the left. They are the progressives. But they have called out what they see as the new social justice activism from one perspective. What happened is that in 2018, they perpetrated a massive academic hoax. These are highly professional scientists, and what they did was they made up several research papers, and they got them published in major scientific journals that deal with gender diversity and so on. And these leading peer-reviewed journals publish them without question. So they're peer-reviewed, which means there are other academics, other researchers around the world who looked at them and said, oh yeah, we agree with that, that's got to go in. And that's a big process, trust me. I've had that sort of thing happen to me. And you've got to rewrite your paper about 3 or 4 times before it's accepted. But these were accepted without question. One of their papers was titled, Our Struggle is My Struggle, Solidarity Feminism as an Intersectional Reply to Neoliberal and Choice Feminism. Easy. Your children are nodding their head. Yeah, we get that. So what they'd done was they had taken a chapter out of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a chapter, and they had simply replaced the words that dealt with the Socialist German Workers' Party with key words to do with feminism. And it got published. There are a few other things that I won't talk about here because it'll take up time, but take a photo of that or go and look it up and you'll see the kind of things that they put up into these journals, and it was all nonsense. And here's what they say in this book. They argue that progressive academics focusing on identity, gender studies, the transgender movement, queer studies, critical race studies, and so on, choose to elevate politically fashionable nonsense over rigorous scholarship. Now, these are people on the left who are saying that. And they say that it's no exaggeration to observe that social justice theories have created a new religion, a tradition of faith that is actively hostile to reason and disagreement of any kind. What kind of things do they say in plain language? Well, let's look at this cartoon from Leunig. And he says, they're warning, this is an inclusive society. And if we think you are talking, thinking, and speaking in a non-inclusive way, you will be excluded. Let's laugh. Let's go back to what they say, these academics. They choose to elevate politically fashionable nonsense over rigorous scholarship. Leunig is brilliant. And so what they're saying is that this new religion is not religious as in terms of spiritual forces, but it's religion in terms of social activism. And they say that Western society is a system of bigotry, power, and privilege. And there's a lot you can read about what they regard as that. Even our language, our economics, our mathematics, our government are all seen as acts of violence. So social activists divide society into oppressed and oppressors, and it's good to remember that when you come into this world and start to make sense of what's going on. So how do they turn people into oppressors and the oppressed? Do you want to experience it here today? Yeah? Of course you do, Hillary. Come on, you do. You can be unholy. Okay, this side here, you're heathens. All right. Can we have the next slide, thanks? You're heathens. The rest of you are holy people. So on this next slide, which is slide 9. We can see here, I want you heathens to read out the secular society narrative and you holy people to read out the church ones. So heathens, we want to do X. Holy people, you are free to do it. We live in a tension, folks. We live in tension. And the people on the same side as the heathens say it's politically fashionable nonsense. And so in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 24, it's saying that like grass, like flowers of the field, the grass withers and the flowers fall. And we're beginning to see a lot of that. But in verse 25, but the word of the Lord endures forever. So let's take hope that we are on the right side of history. So how then do we live on the margins? Well, 1 Peter gives us a number of responses, but I'm going to focus today on simply 4. And the first response to being people who live on the margins is to be different, because we are different. 1 Peter is concerned with issues of Christian identity and behaviour in a non-Christian world, and he argues that God's people should think and act differently because we're different. 14 to 16 in chapter 1, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. Instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct. That means this side of the church too, by the way. You can come back to being holy people. You're no longer heathens. I hereby absolve you. In the name of Ross, in the name of my father and my grandfather as well. There was a letter written to the Emperor Hadrian in about 125 AD, probably about 100 years after Peter was written, and he saw a difference, and he said that concerning the conduct and the truth of the Christians, this is a new people, and he wrote, there is something divine in the midst of them. There was a letter written to Dionysius about 100 years after Peter was written again, Dionysius was, we understand, an advisor to a Roman emperor. And in this letter, he contrasts the life of a Christian with the life of a non-Christian. And he wrote, Christians are like everyone else in nationality, language, dress, food, and manner of life in general. And he even said, they share their meals, but not their wives. And he concludes, thankfully, but there is something extraordinary about their lives. And then he goes on to say, they're attacked by the Jews, they're persecuted by the Greeks, yet no one can explain the reason for this hatred. The world hates the Christians, not because they have done it any wrong, but because the Christians have a moral conscience, whereas the world does whatever they want. So let's take note from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. This is exactly what happened to them. In those days, Peter was writing to these people. They were marked as social misfits to be held in contempt. And we get a sense that this is what's happening with us these days. So we've been here before, and 1 Peter is very instructive about this. So how then do we live on the margins? The first thing is to be different, because difference is noticed. The second thing is to cultivate Christian community. In my own mind, one of the greatest tragedies the church faces is the biblical or sinful behaviours of our very own people. Sure, you can think of recent days, months, and years when prominent Christians, have done things wrong, and socially, ethically, morally, financially, what they are. So, but these kinds of things, they all contribute, don't they, to society's lack of trust and respect for Christianity. And sadly, often our own are to blame. And so it's important that our faith community live a biblical life of grace and hope by cultivating Christian communities. So we've got to remember that 1 Peter was written to people who were despised, social outcasts, outside the gate, a minority, living on the margins, and we shouldn't find it strange that in chapter 5, the writer of 1 Peter addresses the church, because there was no way that the church could afford to raise itself up as a lightning rod for ridicule. They didn't need to draw attention to themselves by doing the wrong thing. And so chapter 5, verses 1 to 4 is an appeal to church officers or leaders to be caring and watchful shepherds, honest and upright, eager to serve, willing to serve, and don't use their authority to lord it over people. So very quickly, verse 2, they should serve not for filthy lucre. Don't you love that word about money, filthy lucre? What a surprise. Church leaders ought not demand or seek financial gain. Ready mind in those verses refers to the love of the work itself, which should be the sole motive in seeking or performing their ministry. People are often surprised that Muslim imams are often, just sleeping in the mosque on a very simple bed. They don't have cars, they don't have a lot of fancy clothes, and that's because the imams are very serious about the message that they have of serving people, and they don't have any guaranteed income, unlike pastors perhaps, and they just take whatever's given to them. Now, I'm not criticising pastors for having a guaranteed income. I'm just drawing attention to the fact that there are other religions where they really do live out this whole thing, about the love of the work itself, and that's why they do it. In verse 5 we read, likewise ye younger, and that refers to the lay people, us, no matter what the age is, and we are urged to show humility. So remember that the social status of the Jesus followers reading this letter were on the margins of society. They were already misunderstood, scorned, belittled, and they couldn't risk the danger of any disagreeable behaviour toward each other at that time. So it's a good thing to be reminded of what good comes from a faith in God and what Jesus does. This whole idea of cultivating community. And you guys do this already. I love coming down. July, I love coming down here to hear the gossip about all the things that the church is doing. Chopping wood yesterday, and a men's barbecue coming up that I wasn't invited to, and on Father's Day, and a whole bundle of things that you guys do. It's just wonderful. It's very inspirational. Even your involvement in the internship, that's got us at Woodvale Baptist working hard to get something happening next year. So, for Cranbrook, all over the world, the money and prayers you use to support missionaries and projects. So keep on doing that. That is cultivating community. But it's good to let the society around us know that democracy, historically, we can show that democracy itself that we enjoy rests on Scripture, on equal rights and dignity. Our justice system, it can be proven from history that our justice system came into play from Christians who wanted to be sure that society treated others as we treat ourselves. Our sense of community rests on the notion that we should love our neighbours as we love ourselves. Australia is one of the is a country in the world that I think, certainly a few years ago when I was dealing with these matters, it had the highest rate of volunteerism in the world, which is a major thing. They call it social cohesiveness, and social capital rather. And that whole sense of cohesiveness is astonishing. We volunteer to do lots of things in Australia. So, and that comes down to this idea of treating others as ourselves. It comes from Scripture, loving our neighbours as we love ourselves. We need to keep on promoting that and cultivating a sense of community that demonstrates that the faith that inspires our good works uses good works to bring about good in society. So that's the second response that Peter offers us to respond to living on the margins. The third one is to hold our ground. To hold our ground. In 1 Peter 4:7 and again in chapter 5, there are 3 verses there that talk about being alert and of sober mind. Being alert and of sober mind. Well, that whole idea is to do more than just be aware. Don't be fuzzy. Think it through. Don't just respond, oh yes, this is what Christians do, but really have a sense of an idea of what it is that grounds our faith. And that those things that we can be proud of, that Christians have contributed to over centuries to bring about the kind of society that we enjoy in Australia. We need to remember that, to be alert and of sober mind so that we can talk about these things in a reasonable and logical way. But there's a purpose to all of this. There's a purpose to being alert and thinking these things through. And that purpose is to pray. Well, there's a whole sermon on prayer that I'm going to leave to others of you who are far better prayers than I am and who can to deal with those things in future days. So there's that whole thing about prayer is there, but that is the purpose of being of sober mind, because we're reminded in Ephesians 6, chapter verses 10 to 18. And you know how it goes, be strong in the Lord in his mighty power, put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. So that's the thing that I'm hanging on to for this point. Hold your ground, because Satan is behind all of this. For our struggle is not against flesh, and then it goes through about the full armour of God, the breastplate of righteousness, and so on and so on and so forth. And then down to verse 18, pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. And with this in mind, here we come, this word again, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Be alert and keep on praying for all the Lord's people. So the emphasis here is to be steadfast, stand firm together and resist Satan. And one of the things that would be worth thinking about is this phalanx that used to be a major military tactic of Roman and Greek soldiers, where in the face of attack they would get together and hold up their shields and overlap their shields around them and overhead, so that they were an impenetrable fortress, if you like, within that little group from the spears that were being thrown. the phalanx. And that's the idea that we're given here, is to stand together and resist Satan, to stand firm. And that's the third point about living on the margins. The fourth and final point is to know. This is a very simple point. Know that God is for us. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10, "And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you firm, strong, and steadfast." This whole idea of restore, the Greek word for that is adjust, and it's used in Matthew and Mark to refer to the mending of nets. You just close your eyes for a moment and think of some fishermen on the seashore mending nets to repair them to be ready to cast out and catch more fish. That's what the word restore comes from. It's also used for to talk about perfecting people and completing people in their spiritual walk. So know that God is for us and that God is restoring us by mending us as though we were nets. So the fourth point, how do we live on the margins? Wait and be willing to be restored so that we can be strong and steadfast. So let's draw this to a close. We live in tension, my friends. We're in proximity to one culture or ideology that holds the values of another. We want to live the kingdom life and have all of its benefits, but there are a lot of people around us who want the benefits but not the king. We're on the margins. We can demonstrate God's coming world and an alternative lifestyle, values and relationships if we heed a warning, follow a pathway, and be encouraged by an encouragement. So we've been given 4 responses from 1 Peter, but let's close with 3 other thoughts as well. The warning is, as Martin Luther King reminds us, he was at the forefront of social justice and change with government policies and so on that discriminated against African Americans. And I love what he said in his I Have a Dream speech. And what he said there resonates today with what we're seeing from these social justice activists who exhibit vitriol and violence, intolerance, and even a lack of common decency. And King said, and this is a warning for us in the way we respond, in the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for justice by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must be like Jesus and not retaliate. The pathway. We can expect God to be glorified by our biblical and Christ-centered responses. This is a verse that's guided me in a lot of the work that I've been doing internationally for a very long time. From Matthew 5, we read, about being salt seasoning that brings out the God flavours of the earth, light, bringing out the God colours of the world. But this is the part that I like. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. Let's just keep living a life of openness and generosity and acceptance and community. And finally, the encouragement. We come back to what I mentioned earlier on about enduring hope that 1 Peter gives us in chapter 1, this idea of enduring hope. And he ends up in chapter 5, verses 11, with a similar idea. And in closing, let us all say this together as a promise to ourselves. Can you go back to that slide? Thanks. Let's say it all together. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. Do we believe it? Some of us do. Do we believe it? Right. And just a comment that if anybody doesn't know the Jesus Christ that I and many others serve, if you're here today and you're wondering who is this Jesus and you haven't actually said, Jesus, I want to be a follower of you, then I encourage you to speak to any of the elders of this church about that. Amen. Or anybody in the church, actually.